Welcome to the Spot On Insurance Podcast, brought to you by ILSA, Insurance Licensing Services of America. This is Ted Tavares.
And this is Arlene Tavares, coming to you from beautiful Puerto Rico. I'm so excited because today we'll be exploring the latest innovations and industry trends.
But before we begin, please remember to click on the subscribe button so you don't miss a single episode. And now, here's our host, Doug Foresta.
Hello and welcome. This is Doug Foresta. With me today is Bob Sargent. He's the founder and president of Tennant Risk Services. I'll say a little bit about him and bring him right on. Tennant Risk Services is a specialty wholesale insurance broker and underwriting manager focusing on professional liability insurance, including the E&O, D&O, EPL, cyber risk insurance coverages. He is the past president of NAPSLO, the National Association of Professional Surplus Lines Organizations, and director of the Derek Hughes NAPSLO Educational Foundation. And he is the author of the Specialty Insurance blog, and he's an insurance writer and speaker, particularly on insurance agents, E&O, and on cyber risk insurance. Bob Sargent, thank you so much for joining me today.
Good morning, Doug. How you doing?
Good. Thank you. I'm really excited about this topic. We haven't discussed it really on the podcast before, and we're going to be talking about cyber risk insurance. So my first question for you is, let's define that term. What do you mean by cyber risk insurance? What is that?
Well, cyber risk insurance is the name of this new coverage, which provides coverage to insureds for a wide range of exposures emanating from cyber risk. It's also called sometimes data breach coverage or network security coverage.
Now, why is this a topic of conversation? Why is cyber risk insurance important?
Well, it's sort of interesting. I mean, I think everybody's seen the press, a lot of talk about breaches, particularly at major companies. And I think there's no easy solution to this. So certainly there's a lot of concern, a lot of talk about the exposures. There's a couple of key trends, I think, that are driving this as well. Certainly exposures have evolved beyond just a data breach, the private information that someone steals or is released, and the nature of the attacks have changed significantly as well. And I think another key trend is that small organizations are now targets. The press talks about the big company breaches, but small to medium-sized companies are seeing quite a bit of activity as well.
Can you say a little bit about that change in the nature of attacks? What kind of change are we seeing?
It's definitely evolving. Certainly the breach that you read about, things like credit card thefts, healthcare records, other confidential information being stolen or released, is still there. But, you've got, for the most part, two other major exposures for small to medium-sized businesses that have sprung up. One is ransomware, and the other is sort of a general term called cybercrime. And these are two areas that are paying off significantly for criminals who are after particularly small to medium-sized businesses.
So maybe we can go through those. So can you describe first cybercrime? What does that entail?
Well, it's a term that it doesn't have sort of a strict definition, but I think the best way to think about it is that criminals are after money, and they use different ways of attacking businesses to get that. So one area would be bank account takeover, and this is a process whereby the criminals are after a business's user credentials for their bank accounts, and they use a variety of means of grabbing those credentials and then getting into the bank accounts and stealing money, wiring or ACHing the money out. Example of that would be a construction company in the West Coast that had $900,000 in a series of wires and ACH transactions taken out of their account. So the bank account takeover is one large segment. That type of crime has died down a bit over the last year or two, and it's been replaced by social engineering fraud, which I think most people have heard about. The FBI calls it business email compromise. And the idea is to use deception to get someone at the target company to send money somewhere to the criminals. So, an example would be that we saw a real estate agent involved in a closing wired $160,000 to the wrong place.
Wow.
Out of the country. Another example was an importer of clothing from overseas that had two transactions where someone was deceived into wiring, $50,000 to $60,000 to someone who was not supposed to get that money in China. And there's other forms of deception. I think, at this time of year, you read about some of the IRS fraud that goes on, tax refund fraud. What another sort of approach that's happening right now is employers are deceived into sending all their employee information, W-2 information, to criminals, thinking they're sending it to another employee in the company. So all these types of approaches are called cybercrime and can really hurt small businesses.
Spot On Insurance is sponsored by ILSA, Insurance Licensing Services of America, America's premier licensing and regulatory compliance experts. To learn more about ILSA and the services they provide, visit ilsainc.com. I was going to say, when you talk about, even 200,000, 250, 900,000, certainly, these numbers can be devastating for a small, medium-sized organization for their cash flow. And I assume that there's not really, if you're not covered, I would assume that there's not really a way to recoup this money, right? You sent it off, it's gone.
It's generally gone. There are some ways people have tightened up the process. There are some ways to prevent this and to grab the money. But, for a well-executed fraud, most of this money does not come back. It hits small businesses hard. Yeah.
So what about ransomware? Can you explain what that is?
Well, ransomware actually right now is the fastest growing form of attack. The criminals or hackers will use some method, phishing or some method of getting someone to inadvertently load some bad software called malware onto their computer. And in the background, that starts encrypting the data. And after the data is encrypted, the software locks up the computer or the data and says you have to pay this extortion money to get your data back. And the actual processes and methodologies vary a little bit, but this has gotten very sophisticated and very deadly. And it used to be, a year ago, generally you pay a small fee, extortion, and you get your data unlocked with a encryption key, and everything's good. And now the numbers have gone up, and the ability to get your data unlocked has gone down. So it can be very destructive. I know one situation, a nonprofit got attacked, locked up one computer. They paid the ransom in Bitcoins, and everything after that was fine. But there was also an attack on a hospital last spring, and that hospital had no access to medical records for a period of about a couple of weeks. Two departments were completely shut down. They were treating patients, with pen and paper, and they could not fully operate. While they paid, I think the number was about $17,000 in ransom, the cost of the business interruption was way, way more than that.
Yeah, it's not just holding your data ransom, it's really holding your business ransom.
Yes, exactly. And it was sort of interesting. There was a recent claim with a food service company, one of these little mobile trucks, and they had a ransomware attack. The criminal was asking for $11,000. They didn't pay it, and all their electronic information was wiped out. They could not operate. They lost a lot of food, and the total bill for that was just under $1 million.
And there's no guarantee. This is not Microsoft customer service. There's no guarantee, right? No matter how much money you pay, it sounds like you said, sometimes you might get the data back. Even if you pay, you still might not get the data back.
That's correct. And there's been reports of paying the ransom, and then the criminals come back and they say, well, you're going to have to pay more ransom. So, and there's actually been some situations where the criminals have actually traded off, where they've got their ransomware and then they sell the access to that victim to another criminal to do it again. So
wow.
These things can be very sophisticated and very deadly.
So we definitely defined the problem. What kind of coverage is needed then to deal with the cyber risk?
you obviously need a fairly comprehensive policy, which is why I think the terminology in the business is going to cyber risk insurance rather than something like data breach coverage, because data breach policies are pretty narrowly focused. You need the coverage that responds to data breaches, ransomware, and to cybercrime exposures, both direct and indirect. But the losses, the direct losses are, fairly straightforward. Things like cost of notification of breaches to victims. There might be some systems repair coverage and, payment of extortion. But it's much more complicated, as we talked about. For example, you've got the business interruption potential from ransomware, and you've got the potential for liability exposure, for getting sued for certain things. There are special wording that's required related to things like credit card records and assessments that might be made by PCI, which runs the credit card back office, I guess, if you will, in our country. There's special wording that's needed for confidential records. It may not be defined terms like what's called PII, personally identifiable information, but it might be a law firm with confidential information. The coverage needs to make sure that it responds to that. So, we've had some situations where we've seen coverage that isn't adequate. So, for example, it could be a policy that includes some, they may call it cyber risk coverage, but it may only respond to a breach. Or we saw a policy that responded to ransomware, an extortion attack, but it only would respond if there was the threat of release of data. And of course, in most ransomware attacks, there is no threat of release of data. So, there's some real nuances, and, I'm sort of a little bit biased in my perspective, but I think it's important to work with a retail agent that is an expert in this area and understands that the needs of the different classes of business or types of businesses and the policies that will respond to those exposures.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like from what you're saying that you really do need to, it would be beneficial at least to work with somebody who's really experienced in this area and understands the potential liabilities that are out there that maybe I don't even realize that I'm leaving myself exposed to.
Exactly.
So that begs the question, like I said, I think we set up pretty well why cyber risk insurance is important and what kind of coverages we might need. If I'm listening to this and I'm a small or medium-sized organization or a large organization, I say, boy, I really do need cyber risk insurance. How would I go about getting it?
Well, I think the process is important. And as I said, dealing with the right people is important. And so we work with retail agents all over the country, where people may contact us if they want. And, we'll get back to them through their retail agent or directly and get them to an agent who understands how to do this. But so that's the who to deal with part. I mean, I think the process is important. The business started out asking too many questions for detailed information, which made it very difficult. We have a bit of a different process where we start with minimal information and make the process easy and try to give the customer some idea of what it's going to cost and what it's going to cover and what the options are.
What's the best way for people to reach out and find out more about you? And if you can give our listeners that information.
Sure. Our website's probably the best place. It's got all our contact information there, and it's Tennant.com and www.tennant.com.
My guest today has been Bob Sargent, founder and president of Tennant Risk Services. Bob, thank you so much for joining me today and sharing your words of wisdom.
Thanks, Doug. Appreciate the time.
Thank you.
Direct your podcast questions to iask@soyteam.com. Share this podcast with your friends and remember to subscribe so you don't miss a single episode.
As always, thanks for joining us. And please remember, we'll be answering this week's podcast questions at Spot On Insurance Facebook, live, Fridays at 11 a.m. Eastern.